Morning.
Thank you, Jason.
Um, on the docket for today is this piece by Alvin Rosenfeld from Tablet magazine. It's entitled "Longing."
Alvin Rosenfeld is, oh, yes. Go on.
It's titled "Longing for Auschwitz: The Ultimate Aims of the War Against the Jewish State Would Rival the Worst Horrors of Our History." So, introduce us
Alvin
to Alvin.
Rosenfeld is literally a friend I've had for 50 years. An extraordinary professor of English at IU, Indiana University. His early work on Elie Wiesel and other survivors, the genre of testimony in literature. And he is the founding director of the Institute for the Contemporary Study of Anti-Semitism at IU, an independent research facility, and his writing as a professor of English is exceptional. So when Alvin writes something, I not only read it, but I read it 3 times to make sure that I've read carefully his use of the language.
Mm-hmm.
He has taken time. It's 5 months now, since 5 months tomorrow, since the massacre. And he wants us to be aware that we don't have a discourse. The nature of language is what is first important to him.
Yeah. So he begins, Hamas's assault on Israelis on October 7th was not an act of war as we normally think of it, but something far worse. We don't have an adequate term for what occurred on that day. So people use words like terrorism, barbarism, atrocity, depravity, massacre, and so on. All are correct, and yet all fall short.
I think he doesn't draw the parallel because he's a professor of English, not a politician and international relations pundit. That is actually where our problem with October 7th begins. It has required of us a review of language, of glossary. You can't now continue to evaluate Israel's military behavior based on a war initiated by an annihilationist, eliminationist terrorist organization. So, what does proportionality mean? I mean, I think this is exactly where all of us have to start with October 7th. It's where every Jew is beginning to now understand our identity has changed. Our relationship to a Middle Eastern state, not just a Zionist homeland. Nothing that has happened since October 7th meets all the categories we used to have. So there we are. Here's a list of words, and none of them works. None of them honestly describes what happened.
So, in the context of his piece here, give us an example for why the word terrorism or barbarism don't work.
Well, we're in a social media digital platform world, and so we accept information data from, quote, the Hamas health. And are they reliable? Did Israel really bomb a hospital? The UN came out with a report on the nature of the sexual violence committed on the 7th, and they confirm it happened at least twice. That was their twist. We know at least twice. And in order to make sure there's equivalency They've now asked the IDF to be able to permit the UN to see if any Palestinian prisoners have been sexually assaulted. So the categories don't line up.
Mm-hmm.
How do you measure a unilateral act? I keep coming back to the fact that there was a ceasefire in place until October 7th. And Hamas intended, there was no accident here. This was an intentional act of violence. And I don't know a word. We can't use radical evil. What word do you have for men coming and wantonly destroying human life in a way that humiliates, terrifies, ergo terrorist, but it destroys life in a way that your mind, no, we talked early in one of our conversations, it is unthinkable. We could agree that all pornography is not obscene, but pornography of children being violated, pornography of, quote, snuff films in which you kill someone during a rape, that surely is pornographic. And they did both of those.
Yeah. And that's, reading this piece, it's so, part of the commitment to telling the truth and not bearing false witness is a commitment to plain speech, right? And clarity, at least, so that's like, that's what Mennonites would insist upon. And so one of the things Alvin has done here at the very top of his piece is be very precise in describing what happened. And so, he just says, the people attacked in those places were not only to die, but to die in torment. In addition to the merciless torture, killings, slashings, burnings, beheadings, mutilations, dismemberments, and kidnappings, there were gang rapes and other forms of sadistic sexual assault, including, according to some reports, the cutting off of women's breasts, nails driven into women's thighs and groins, bullets fired into their vaginas, and even intercourse with female corpses. Unimaginable for most people, yes. But before going into Israel, the Hamas assassins were instructed to dirty them and whore them. And that's precisely what many of them faithfully did. It's, for me, it's there's the danger of wanting to have an equivalence on the part of the media. But then there's also the challenge of wanting to not re-traumatize people by repeating what was done. But if you don't name what happened in its specificity, a word like atrocity doesn't really lift the luggage.
So we're now attempting to do what every basic act of education does. You can't go into any classroom to teach anything without first deciding what is the language I will use. Mm-hmm. How will I speak in order for people to understand what I'm saying, and ideally to create a conversation. I was often criticized during my entire career for using language that was above people, and people would say, why don't you talk like the rest of us? Okay, but that remains a challenge. 5 months later, what has happened? And when you do have a media inside the whole identity, culture, war, and so you can't describe it, but you immediately say 75 years of colonialist behavior. What? What have you just done? Why can't we be present to an act that was intentionally predetermined by the terrorist organization. They did this, have said they will do it again. Why can't they be taken at face value?
Mm-hmm.
There are times when the nature of evil, most certainly since Auschwitz, where we have no words available, and because we fumble, because we stutter, because we want to say something and don't know how to say it, we come out with stupidity. So Alvin is challenging us in his first paragraph. Stop. What do you mean? Jews will experience this differently than, and just that sentence. Yes. Jews experience this differently. We have family there. This is, quote, our homeland. And so the terror of the day is translated. This was literally done to the Jewish people. Okay, so we're attempting, and have been since our conversations began, to model that two people who are different, age, cultural structure, we can discuss this. We can discuss what we don't always agree. We can search together for how do we explain this. And what Alvin requires us to do, and I think it's a lesson for the whole community at large, is admit, I don't know how to say something.
Yeah, so he, in another paragraph, he writes, all wars cause human suffering, but the cruelties visited upon Israelis on October 7th far surpasses what normally happens when armies go to war. Hamas's actions had a different aim, not conquest, but the purposeful humiliation of Jews by people who detest them and were sworn to degrade and dehumanize them before murdering them. And then he lists some historical, violent historical events that October 7th recalls in Jewish memory.
Nazi behavior, and here Alvin knows this from all his work in post-Holocaust literature. Nazis intentionally pacified Jews by humiliation.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take the simplest act. They took off all their clothes in a room where men and women and children were all together. Nothing can humiliate, especially Orthodox Jews, more than being publicly naked.
It's because you mentioned this last week, and someone commented to me at church, a friend who had listened, that the practice of stripping Jews naked and cutting their hair recalled for her how the federal government treated Native American children as they were enrolled in reservation schools.
Mm-hmm. And then let's add one more. We're going to take away your name and tattoo you.
Yeah.
Tattoos are prohibited by Jewish law. Contemporary realms of inking notwithstanding, which I don't find offensive. It's a generational issue, but that's one of the reasons they were tattooed.
Mm-hmm.
They lost what defines them in a name, became a number, and had to live with evidence of doing something prohibited by Jewish. That is humiliating. And They did this on the Sabbath on a festival, but we know it was planned to have been done on the first night of Passover. So I make a distinction between that which is intended. That which is intended is something for which you are accountable. Something that happens by accident. You don't plan it, but it occurs. Okay, that's a toss-up. This was, and Alvin notes, intended. Its purpose was different even than a suicide bomber. Getting on a bus, how many people can I kill at the same time? That's different than I'm going to go to where people have safe rooms and make the safe rooms the easiest way to kill them before I burn them alive. Now, that's part of the plan. They terrified all Israel. I think people should accept the trauma done to Israel, to diaspora Jewry, and we can also talk at a separate moment about the policies the Israeli government and military have used. The criticism of Israel and its war on Gaza isn't to be ignored, but it is not a platform for equivalence.
And so, yeah, and this gets to a move he makes here in this article. He writes, the preamble to the Hamas Charter declares that Israel exists and will continue to exist until Islam obliterates it, just as it obliterated others before it. The, quote, Palestinian problem, it affirms, is a religious problem and is not amenable to a negotiated political settlement. The only way to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine is through jihad. These are all quotes from Hamas. A holy war that is a duty for every Muslim, wherever he may be. As a result of their success in invading Israel on October 7th and killing and capturing so many Jews, Hamas has incited the passions of many in the broader Arab and Muslim worlds, and alarmingly well beyond. In doing so, it has made emphatic the Islamist reading of the Arab-Israeli conflict as essentially a Muslim-Jewish conflict. Most people in the West view the problem as basically political and territorial in nature. That is true, but only in part. As represented by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, it is also religious. And at its heart of hearts, there resides an annihilationist fantasy of killing Jews and bringing an end to the Jewish state. Hamas and its allies are not looking for a two-state solution, but a repeat of the final solution.
And for someone who believes that interfaith relations and interfaith dialogue is and can be still a reality, I would argue privately with Alvin that his correct framing of the problem now makes the rock bigger to push up the hill.
Yeah.
Up until September 11th, 2001, ministerial associations, interfaith groups, were Jewish Christian groups.
Mm-hmm.
They quickly became Jewish Christian Muslim groups. Had to be. On the issue of Israel, this now becomes problematic.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that Muslims in America abide by this reading of the Quran and the Surah. But how do you do dialogue with the many different kind of Muslims we find in so many different communities. We've been doing Jewish-Christian dialogue seriously for more than 60 years. Serious post-Auschwitz interfaith conversations. This is not a time to assume that the small little mosque in the suburb is going to have an imam who can handle Alvin Rosenfeld's challenge. I would bring you, were I still a pulpit rabbi, to my congregation, and we would do this together. I don't know many imams ready to do that. I'm not discounting the challenge. The challenge is something Jews and Christians in dialogue are going to have to talk about. And this is one of the reasons that the word Islamophobia simply has, it no longer means anything in the way we use it. It's not a phobia. He did not describe a phobia. Phobias are fears, maybe even psychiatrically anchored fears. What does this describe? This describes a profound textual hatred of Jews. And then people become afraid. They're not afraid of Islam. They're afraid that Islam hates them. That is not Islamophobia. But just like the first paragraph, we don't have a word to use for that.
Speaking of words, so he goes on in the article to talk about, so he says, the widespread and unapologetic branding of Israel as an apartheid, genocidal, even Nazi state that were accusations that were in wide circulation well before October 7th are rapidly becoming normalized.
Look,
so it's words.
I have not liked. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's just he keeps returning to this notion that words matter.
Oh God, we are worse than lazy. We don't understand the words we use. We don't hold each other accountable for the words we use. I'm too old to cry. My extraordinary daughter-in-law, a brilliant middle school teacher, told me she'd removed all the dictionaries from her class. What? What? And she held up a cell phone. They have it here. And I then did cry and said, but when I was in those classrooms and I was done with my work, which happened far too often, I read the dictionary. You remove dictionaries, you remove the possibility of student finding a word they weren't looking up. Yes, as an English professor, Alvin Rosenfeld is demanding. You say things you don't mean. You don't understand what you're saying. Apartheid is a unique statement of a legal apparatus of black. Yes, black what? It was a South African legal system. There are clearly problems with Israeli security policy and protocols. Absolutely. Are they intentionally meant to humiliate and pacify. Maybe, I don't know, but it's not apartheid. So that only adds to the hypocritical insult of the new all-black government of South Africa going to The Hague to suggest that Israel has committed genocide. If I don't understand a word in Portuguese, should I fake it? Should I stop the conversation and say, please, that's a conjugation I don't understand? Or because I've immigrated and I don't want to be a bore, should we just move on? And I figure in any given day, I make between 70 and 80% correct understanding. That's still 20 to 30% that's up for grabs. Mm-hmm. And my wife correctly nags me, stop us. You're embarrassed, but we need you to understand. Okay, here Alvin Rosenfeld is saying, we do that in English with each other.
Yeah.
Is it that I'll share something that I did to all my children. They tease me about it. They will often say, that's hard. To which I go, no, that's hard. You mean difficult. Is it that we're lazy? Is it that the speed with which we need to communicate doesn't permit that kind of nuancing? Oh, Dad, you know what I meant. I did. But language is a discipline. And we need to help each other. And I think October 7th is requiring more of all of us than we were aware. Someone said to me the other day, so do you really think that Biden's support, unconditional support after October 7th could hurt his reelection? Look at what's happened in Michigan, yesterday in Minnesota. So I said, I suppose the Jews did that too.
Well, and for me, that storyline is a good example of the media having a story pre-written in search of data to support it, because the uncommitted vote in places like Michigan was almost exactly the same when Barack Obama ran for re-election. So the idea that you're going to interpret it as a protest vote against Biden's position on Israel is just not factually accurate at all. But the narrative was set before votes were cast.
Yep.
So let's talk about this other article you sent me. It is entitled...
No, there's one more piece.
Oh, okay.
I don't want to leave Alvin before he gets to his extraordinary last paragraph. You read the last paragraph. Hamas set out to reverse.
Hamas set out to reverse it as forcefully as possible on October 7th. Its murderous deeds on that day were meant to debase and kill Jews and rally others to collectively put an end to the Jewish state. A strategic objective that recalls some memorable words of the Hungarian Jewish writer and Holocaust survivor Imre Kertész, the anti-Semite. The anti-Semite of our age no longer loathes Jews. He wants Auschwitz. Today's most passionate anti-Semites continue to loathe Jews, and for that very reason, want Auschwitz. If Israelis were not fully aware of those hateful passions before October 7th, they surely know them now. They also know that one Holocaust is one too many, and are committed to doing whatever they must to make sure there will not be a repeat. They need and deserve all the support we can give them.
Imre Kertész, a Hungarian Jew who is the only Hungarian ever to win the Nobel Prize. Won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2002. I'm sure bitterly disappointed yet another Hungarian Jew, Elie Wiesel, who, though he was a Nobel Peace Laureate and never got the prize in literature.
And
Kertész is correct. One of the problems of Auschwitz, post-Holocaust theology, post-Holocaust language, is you've now set a bar. You've set a standard. Never again refers to not permitting the Jewish people to be exterminated. And October 7th was a single day, single site, minuscule act of attempted extermination. Was not a bus attack.
mm-hmm.
It was not a rocket attack. It was old and profound human attack on other humans. Do I like the title, Longing for Auschwitz? It's a disgusting title. The way Dara Horn's People Love Dead Jews is a disgusting title. But tragically, it's true. It's not an exaggerated extrapolation. I think Imre Kertész is correct. The anti-Semite of our age no longer, the word missing, merely loathes Jews. He wants Auschwitz. Now, I don't think all anti-Semites all want the complete extermination of the Jewish people. But I think anti-Semitism has once again reached thresholds that stimulate the Kertész statement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is why Jews have changed since October 7th. The other piece is a good op-ed on the language of equivalency and written by someone I trust in the construct of looking at reality.
So this is Nicholas Kristof.
Began, right.
Israel, Gaza, and double standards.
I don't think we can assume, especially now 5 months later, that the attack on October 7th is a meaningful, accessible memory. They need only look at CNN and their news feed. That's what they're reacting to. And the tens of thousands that have died, the famine, the disease, okay, it's needs to stop. And what will you then do with what's left?
Mm-hmm.
And Kristof admits, and that's why I sent you, he admits that there is a double standard. That is it language? Is it a built-in default that the hatred of Jews changes every conversation about Israel? That's nightmarish. I can't go there.
Yeah, he at the beginning here, he references Benjamin Netanyahu on Face of the Nation last weekend, in his response, what would America do after something like the October 7th Hamas attack? Would you not be doing what Israel is doing? You'd be doing a hell of a lot more.
They did this within hours of getting on the airways on October 7th. They were beginning to say, and what did America do after 9/11? There are no comparable experiences. 9/11 was the single most horrific act of foreign terrorism ever in United States history.
Or the better
and
analogy,
its plan,
like the comparable analogy, I think is ISIS in Syria,
yeah,
and in which the U.S. did do things that look a lot like what Israel's doing in Gaza, and that's not to justify it. It's just part of the problem, I think, is Americans' inattention to the news in any sort of detail.
and let's remember that Obama drew a red line, and Syria and Russia crossed it and smiled, and we did nothing. So it doesn't matter what America would have done if Proud Boys had come from wherever they had come from and done this to a community. It's a twisted, unlikely analogy. This is a group that has been at eliminationist war with Israel since its inception. There is no other group like it that can foster comparable ideas. And I don't think the world knows what to do with that reality. That's why the two essays work well together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Christoph says, people are more focused on Israel than on what UNICEF describes as a wave of atrocities currently underway against children in Sudan. While the number of children displaced by recent fighting in Sudan, 3 million, is greater than the entire population of Gaza. University students in America and European protest about Gaza, but largely ignore the 700,000 children facing severe acute malnutrition in Sudan after a civil war began there last April.
Or for that matter, what Russia has done in kidnapping Ukrainian children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's. I mentioned to you last week. I've been reading Timothy Snyder, and the phrase he uses about Putin's aims in terms of a colonialism of the mind, and I think that comes out in ways more general than just what's going on in Ukraine. That we. A lot of our minds are captured by propaganda whose roots we can't necessarily see.
And it looks like we're in for 8 months of a presidential election that will become binary at levels of stupidity never before thought possible in American history.
Yeah.
I think when he writes, the Darfur region of Sudan 2 decades ago endured what is widely described as the first genocide of the 21st century. Now, bands of gunmen once more are killing and raping villagers. And there is nothing in the press, at the UN, no protest shutting down any universities. The word hypocritical doesn't meet the standard of my anguish. Can you tell me what you think creates this unilateral obsession with Israel over and against a whole global list of atrocities?
Mm-hmm. And Christoph does a good job here. So is there a double standard in global attention? Absolutely. Defenders of Israel have every right to point all of this out, and sometimes it does reflect anti-Semitism. Yet, now we get to the other side, it also strikes me as unconscionable to use the world's hypocrisy, however invidious, to justify the death of thousands of children in Gaza.
Which goes back to Alvin's first paragraph. What have we done to the language we're using?
Mm-hmm.
We obfuscate, we intentionally deny, we create a mechanism where intended falsehood is the mechanism of communication. What? How is that possible in the 21st century to agree to say nothing to each other because what we're saying we know to be false? I think he's correct. The amount of double standards is not an excuse for a lack of self-critical awareness in Israel and by the Jewish community globally. That's absolutely correct.
Yeah, it's I mean, I think one of the lessons, right, is a willing. You have to be willing to confront history as it's happening, and not filter it through a preconceived narrative that you're loyal to.
Bingo. That's it. And how do we treat that educational goal?
Yeah.
Colleges, universities, high schools. What do we say in order to incorporate a communal discourse that we can share, that isn't pre-filtered by all the separate issues of gender, orientation? The burden of language is so heavy that people won't stop to think about what they say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, to think about that. So, for Christians, we're creeping up towards Holy Week, and one of the non-theological lessons, right, of the Passion story is that the mob is always wrong, and separating yourself out from the mob requires intentionality.
It's called mob contagion. Pretty difficult when they're all screaming, "Crucify him, crucify him." Okay. Was it 80%, 90%, the whole crowd, 70%? All the Jews were responsible? No, let's contextualize that. Just all the Jews in that crowd.
Or just, like I like to remind people, Caiaphas saying it's better for one man to die than for all Israel to die. I'm like, well, that's probably true. so you can have a perfectly sound, self-justified political position, and it's still wrong.
Wait, just a minute. I think what the text meant was all the Judeans who were present there. Oh, that may not have all been Jews.
We should talk on Palm Sunday.
Oh, let's talk about that.
Well, Joseph,
You're going to send me
yeah,
that
I will do.
lectionary.
I will do that. I will do that. Yeah. So I hope you continue to heal up, and
Thank
I
you.
will see you on Monday.